Due to the graphic nature of this program, viewer discretion is advised.
When the night is dark and the moon is masked in cloud, we see things in the shadows, things that frighten us, things we don't understand. Movies and TV sometimes scare us too, but we know they're just make-believe, the creation of a fertile imagination. But what you are about to experience was not made up in Hollywood. The ghosts you are about to meet are real. The stories you'll hear are true. There is no doubt. Fact is stranger than fiction. Have you seen a ghost? Know someone who has? Actor Telly Savalas has no doubt he's seen one. In fact, he experienced one of the most frightening encounters of all time. And it changed him forever.
Now, what I'm about to tell you is true if you want to hear it.
I do want to hear it.
You do want to hear it, then I'll tell you. I was never superstitious.
I'll give you a ride.
But then something happened in my life which scared the hell out of me. And for something like that to happen to me is something that I can't understand to this day. God knows how many years ago. Let me think now. 58, 59. It's a lot of years ago. Now, I just left off a date. Beautiful young girl since left us. And it's about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm going home to Long Island after dropping her off. And as would happen, I ran out of gas. And I go into this White Castle restaurant. I says, is there a gas station open? He says, yeah. He says, you walk through the woods there. He says, get on the Grand Central Parkway, take it to the Cross Island Parkway. He says, and the gas station there open all night. Okay. So I am, start walking through the woods, a wooded area, not the woods, going up, and as I'm doing that, I hear a voice say,
I'll give you a ride.
I turn around, and there's this guy in the Cadillac. And I didn't hear the Cadillac.
You hear the voice, and what do you see?
I see a guy in a white suit, and I hear an effeminate voice say, I'll give you a lift. I said, that's very nice. I said, I'm going to a gas station. We get to the gas station, talking very nice. And I'm fumbling around in my pockets. He says, I'll lend you $1. Well, I didn't ask him for money. And the truth is, I was broke. And I said, well, look, I says, you know, I've worked for the State Department and, well, anyway, give me your name and address, all right? Allow me to mail it to you because I'm very embarrassed. Anyway, I go there, I get a can, pay for the gas. We start driving back to my car to put the gas in the car, and I thought that was very nice of him. And then in the clear blue sky, he says, I know, I'm not going to mention the name, I know so-and-so. And it's a baseball player. We weren't talking baseball. Oh, I said, who's he? He says, well, he's a
utility infielder for the Boston Red Sox.
Oh, it's so bizarre that he would say it in the spookiest voice I ever heard. He kept driving, get to my car, put the gasoline in. He pushes me to get it started. My car starts. I thank him very much. All in all, it's a very lovely experience to meet someone to help you out like that. No incident whatsoever. Go home, go to work in the morning, get out in the afternoon, this headline in the then Journal American. So-and-so dead. The guy he mentioned in that very spooky voice, age 20-some-odd, young ball player, under very mysterious circumstances. Autopsy and all that stuff. I said, God, what a frightening coincidence. I go home and I says, hey, Ma, isn't that funny? My mother, I think, was part witch. I explained it to her. She says, well, yeah, Telly, strange things that do happen. I said, but. And then I remembered that he gave me a piece of paper for me to send $1 to. I look at it, and there besides the address is a telephone number. Okay. Pick it up and I called the number. Jimmy's Bar. Well, I said, well, can I speak to Mr. Cullen, please? Oh, Mr. Cullen, just a minute. Woman gets on the phone.
Who's calling?
Hi, may I speak to Mr. Cullen, please?
He's not here.
Well, when do you expect him?
Who is this?
I says, well, I was with Mr. Cullen last night, and he gave me this telephone number, and he said I could reach him here. She says,
Look, you son of a bitch, I don't know what you're talking about. You're talking about my husband, and he's been dead for 2 years.
Anyway, I wouldn't let it go. I did get in touch with the woman again. I did meet her in New York. She came down from Boston. Because, you know, this is a little too much. The clothes I described were the clothes he just buried in. The piece of paper that he gave me signed James Cullen. She brought a letter that he wrote her when he was in the Army. It had Jimmy on that. Outside of that, the signature is identical. There's only one thing that was different. I said he had a high voice. She said, oh, no, she said. He had a deep voice like yours. Oh. Then it meant he killed himself. This way, right through the voice. Box, whatever. Anyway, this story happened to a guy like me, and as I say, it's been haunting me now close to 40 years.
In 1918, a young man was killed. Nothing unusual in that. During the Great War, they were dropping like flies. But the death of Freddie Jackson shocked the airbase where he was stationed and had an everlasting impact on a young woman serving there. Not that she was madly in love with him, indeed she hardly knew Freddie, but his face haunts her even today, 75 years on. This is her story.
We were very sad when we heard he had died, because he was one of a group. I suppose it was the comradeship. We were all the transport yard was very much a sort of, yes, we might almost say a clique.
This was Bobby Capel's extended family in 1918, the men and women of the transport yard at Cranwell in Lincolnshire.
I had a job of going round to the officers' mess every morning in my tender, which was then rather like a Land Rover now, they looked like. And I was to take any officers who wanted to go into Sleaford, which was the local town. And the Blue Jacket used to come out and say, Liberty boat alongside, so anybody for the shore?
Friendship blossomed. Then one day, just before the unit was disbanded, it was decided there should be a group photograph. A souvenir of their time together, something to keep forever.
I remember us all getting very smart and spick and span to be photographed.
But there was someone missing in the lineup, a young mechanic called Freddie Jackson. Freddie had died only days earlier, though not at the hands of the enemy. Rather, it was said he had walked into a propeller. His would be the one face missing from the photograph.
We all said we wanted a copy, and we were handed our copies. And there was quite a gasp of surprise because this young man who had been in the transport yard and had been away on leave and had died appeared in the top row, quite recognizable to us all.
To the right and behind the shoulder of the man wearing the hat is Freddie's face.
He's got no hat on. Everybody else has got a hat on. He's quite obviously just his hair. So he's different from the rest. Once you've seen it and knew the face, it was unmistakable. He would undoubtedly have been in the photograph if he hadn't died. And there he was. I think we all thought it was exceedingly spooky. It was very eerie to us, this man who we'd known in the transport yard, appearing so clearly when we knew he was dead. This was a tremendous shock in a way. It's been a very definite memory in my mind all my life. And I'm glad I kept the photograph. I suppose this made one think pretty carefully about it. But I had a sister who saw ghosts who I certainly couldn't disbelieve. So I have no reason not to believe in ghosts. I don't think I've ever, well, I can't say I've never seen one myself, but I suppose looking at this photograph I have.
The craggy coast and dark woods of the American North hide horrors from the past. The brutal settling of the untamed land claimed many victims. And even today, some seem reluctant to leave this world. Trapped spirits haunt one town hall in New Hampshire. Locals refuse to enter its doors alone. And never after dark.
The police station of Alton, New Hampshire, was in the town hall basement. The chief, Thomas Mintzwer, was on duty late at night when he heard it.
I heard noises and I came upstairs to investigate, and it sounded, because you could very distinctly tell, front door closing and opening, because it slammed, it was so heavy, and you could tell if somebody was walking in the hallway. And being downstairs, we would come upstairs to see who was in the building, because at the time the building upstairs was closed. And coming upstairs, you'd find no one.
Alton's town planner, Glenn McLean, is not the kind of man given to wild imagination. He's experienced it too.
You really start to feel like there's somebody right behind you. There's some physical things that happen. You feel your hair start to stand up on end. You feel that presence.
The local radio personality, Scott McKay, stayed in the town hall overnight. He thought to dispel the myth.
My impression coming in was one of skepticism, not too sure what I would find. I really didn't have a fixed thought on whether I believed in any supernatural or not. And when I left the next morning, I still wasn't too sure, but I do know that something happened.
And Alton's town historian, Judith Fry, is just about ready to include the ghost in official records.
I think it's happened too many times just to be a coincidence. And I think there's really some merit in it.
It usually happens sometime after midnight. And it continues until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. These are the hours of the Alton Town Hall ghost. By day, the old town hall is typical of any stately historic site you might find in a small town of New England. This one stands with town pride. Its 100th anniversary is coming up, and a celebration like Alton hasn't seen for many years is planned. Some townsfolk are wondering if the big event might stir something unexpected, even unwanted, in the old landmark. The people who live daily with the town hall ghost are certain about 2 things. It exists, and if you don't bother it, then it doesn't bother you. While the Alton Town Hall haunting seems unthreatening, no ghost story of recent times has had more credible or official witnesses. The people who believe it most fervently are the city officials and police. They live with it.
When you distinctly hear footsteps and you know them to be footsteps and hear the same type of noise and come up and not find anybody, check all the doors in the offices, find them all closed, and check the building and there's nobody there, makes you wonder.
There were a lot of times when things disappear. You go crazy looking for them because you're sure that they were where you left them. You look around, you can't find them. You come back, and they were where you left them. And you start asking yourself some questions.
A lot of the city employees who work in the town hall by day refuse to enter the building alone, and never after dark.
Good morning. I survived the night at the Alton Town Hall.
The radio announcer Scott McKay thought he was going to make fun of the whole affair when he stayed alone in the building overnight.
When I left with the last employee. She was going off to a class. I was going out to get something to eat before I came back to settle in for the night.
You locked the doors.
Locked it up. I had supposedly the only key that I know of.
Lights were out.
Everything was turned off except the entrance light.
Yet when he returned, everything had changed.
When I came up to the room, all my stuff was gone. My whole gear, my sleeping bag, my knapsack. So I started looking around, came in this room here. Next thing I know, there it is in the judge's chair.
After finding his sleeping bag, he noticed his TV set was also gone.
After I retrieved my knapsack, I came over to the stairway here, and down at the bottom of the stairway was my monitor. Nothing wrong with it. It wasn't broken. It just looked like it had been placed down there.
All night long, he heard footsteps when no one was there, noises that no one was making, felt a presence that made his hair stand on end.
Even though I was lying here on the floor, supposedly alone in the building, something told me that I wasn't alone.
What he encountered was consistent with everything the police chief and his men had been quietly telling each other for years.
They would find lights on in the building as they drove past and turn around and come back to check them, and the lights would be out.
The sound of doors slamming has been a constant unexplained noise for anyone who stayed alone in the town hall after dark. The cell door in the old basement police station has been a sobering reminder that Alton's most famous building is never quite empty. And the dogs. The stories about the police dogs are what spooks the town planner Glenn McLean most of all.
The dog would want to respond to something upstairs. The officers on duty would take the dog upstairs and let the dog run. It would go down the main hall on the first floor of the building, hit the steps that lead to the second floor, go about 2 steps up and stop.
The question of whose spirit occupies the town hall has never been answered. One story is that a city elder responsible for the town clock long ago was killed in the tower. Another concerns a woman named Sarah Glidden. Like witches of old, she's buried beneath granite in the town cemetery. Some think her spirit has escaped.
In 1825, a lady by the name of Sarah Glidden, who was a resident of East Alton, was struck down on a clear day by lightning and was killed. This incident has been documented in the church record.
Whatever walks the corridors of Alton Town Hall at night, the townsfolk either don't want to know or don't want to disturb it.
I want to be on the record with the ghost as being respectful of it because I believe it is here.
With the town hall's big centennial celebration coming up, the people of Alton just hope the ghost enjoys a party.
Bert Weston is not the kind of man to make up stories. He lives on his own, does community work, and carries the vivid memory of that night way back in the 1920s.
To some of us, in later life, comes nagging thoughts of things we did, things we didn't do, or help we should have given and didn't give. How could I explain, or how could I tell people the story of a figure that appeared in the moonlight and then scared the wits out of horses and out of me, and then dissolved, disappeared. The local verdict would be plain. In a country district, I'd done the unspeakable thing of galloping away from a call for help. Back in those days, in my early 20s,
my hobby was riding jumping horses at country shows. This night, I was heading home from a show on the southern tablelands. The air was clear and the night felt good. When we came to a small creek, I dismounted to let the horses take some water, and I walked around them, a little upstream. I remember the water was pure, and especially that it was icy cold. I would recall how cold it was later, when I had to reassure myself I'd been wide awake during the events of this night. It was also a night of a full moon, and as the moon rose higher in the sky, it flooded the countryside with brightness. As I remounted, I sensed the horses were as keen and as happy as I that we were heading home. It had been a long day. As I came up out of the creek, I noticed a homestead, Dingo Creek. It was familiar, and I remembered passing this place earlier on my way out to the show. It was about then that I saw it, the figure of a man hurrying down from the farmhouse. There was something strange about the way he looked and moved, waving to get my attention. It was odd in that he was wearing a funny old white helmet, the ones they call tiger shooters, and he had a white beard, white shirt, and an old waistcoat that was flapping open. Then, just as suddenly, he disappeared behind a tree by the shed. His waving had seemed urgent, but when I went behind the shed to find him, he was gone. There was a couple of stockyards there, and I made my way to the fence. But there was no sign of him here either. There was just a bull. It seemed peaceful enough at this point, but the old man vanished. Where? Hello? Where are you? Jesus! Suddenly, everything was crazed confusion. I could hear cries for help. A woman calling from the veranda. The horses bolting away. The bull charging. It was chaos, and I panicked. I was scared. I just wanted to get out of there.
Help me! Help!
And before midnight, we reached the township, and soon after, we were the horses safely in the stables, and I was in bed.
As mysterious, bizarre, otherworldly as the event you have just witnessed might appear, I should remind you that Bert Weston is a real man who was in this real room on that very real night on the 16th of May 1923, some 70 years ago.
Next morning, in the light of day, the terrifying events of the night didn't seem so bad. But I was puzzled. I thought I'd find out
something that might explain what had happened. I had a terrible feeling that I had failed someone the night before.
Have a beer, mate. Yeah, thanks.
The men were talking about a farmer named Jack Hearn who had a property.
Something called Dingo Creek.
And my heart froze. I tried to stay calm as I heard how that afternoon Hearn had gone to feed his bull. Something had gone wrong. The bull had charged and gored him.
Yeah, got him in the belly.
You can't get careless with new bulls.
Hearn had crawled to the house and collapsed in front of his wife, Lara. There was nobody there to help.
Yeah, it's bleeding real bad. Not much Laura could do for him.
Then they talked about an unknown horseman arriving. Me! I was the unknown horseman. And how, when called to help, I'd ridden off into the darkness.
And the horseman took off at full belt.
This morning the bull was gone.
Jack died around midnight.
Dear God! But who was the ghostly old man? Could I have imagined that?
I knew Jack well. I knew his father as well, old Frank. Funny old chap. Used to wear this old tiger shooting helmet. I remember the straggly beard he had. And he used to always wear this old waistcoat. I think he slept in the thing. Funny thing is, exactly 20 years ago, he was killed in those same yards.
Though I would never have all the answers to that night, I came to believe what happened to me at Dingo Creek. I stumbled onto a farm where a man lay dying, his wife crying for help, a plea from a father who had died 20 years earlier. I panicked, because in my heart I knew I'd seen a ghost. The local verdict would be plain.
In a country district, I'd done the unspeakable thing of galloping away from a call for help. I'll never forget that night. I can still see it as bright as day. There are things that one should have done, things that one should not have done, help one should have given and didn't. I could have done better.
A rusting, burnt-out hulk, etched against the evening sky. Once proud, the steamer Alkimos lies deserted off the Western Australian coast. But there are many who believe that on board there lurks an evil presence. They say the Alkimos is a ghost ship, a haunted ship that has brought nothing but terror and tragedy to those who've dared venture onto it.
I have always described it as being an evil ship. Definitely an evil ship.
And Jack Sue should know. He's one of Australia's most experienced scuba divers, a man who's spent decades investigating the Alkimos and its ghost, a ghost who goes by the name of Henry. Jack can't be certain, but he estimates that in the last 30 years or so, more than 20 people, directly or indirectly involved with this twisted wreck, have met untimely deaths.
My advice is don't go. Whether they be divers or photographers or whatever. It's not really worth the risk.
For almost 4 centuries, this stretch of water off Western Australia has been a graveyard for ships and their crews. From the galleons of days gone by to the giant oil tankers of today. The Alkimos joined the long list of casualties on March the 20th, 1963, when she went aground on a voyage from Indonesia. From that day on, there's been calamity after calamity. All attempts to salvage her have failed, and now she sits there with only her ghost for company.
It's created so much unhappiness, so much sickness, so much hardship for people who've gone broke. There just hasn't been any end of it for 27 years.
This is no place for anyone with a weak heart.
That diary entry was written by a young American exchange student who took what he thought was a cushy part-time job as caretaker on the Alkimos. The diary convinced Jack Sue that there was more to this ship than meets the eye.
I thought this was a bit of a farce at first, until I started reading the diary. And this young guy, Wayne Morgan, started off the diary by saying that how enthusiastic he was about going out on this ship as a caretaker, because he needed a suitable place to do some SWAT quietly, and also it gave him the opportunity to put some time into his favourite pastime, was line fishing.
But that easy life would soon come to an abrupt and frightening end. The young American began hearing noises at night, began feeling a presence he couldn't see.
He was so scared of moving around the ship. And of course the steps, he mentioned the steps above his cabin so many times that, it wasn't funny.
14th of July, 63, 10:15 p.m. Been down to the engine room, but never again. The eeriest place on the ship. From the time I left my cabin, I could hear footsteps following. I was scared out of my wits.
There was no movement on the ship. It was a calm night, and all of a sudden, the doorway between the captain's cabin and the bridge slammed shut with a hell of a force. Wayne described it as though somebody had deliberately slammed the door. And he got such a hell of a fright, he dropped the torch, dropped the book, and he just fled in the opposite direction. Willy-nilly, he had no idea where he was going, but finished up down in the engine room and eventually found his way back to his cabin. But he said he vowed and declared then he would never go out at night again out of his cabin.
The noises went on and on. The young American became more and more frantic. Finally, he could take no more. He left this cursed ship and was admitted to hospital, a psychiatric hospital. Henry the Ghost had claimed his first caretaker.
After studying the diary, Jack Sue knew he had to see and hear what was going on for himself. He joined up with sound recordist Graham Greenwood, and one night, against their better judgment, they tried to record the noises that had driven the American to the brink of madness.
When we eliminated things like the sea and noises like that, there were almost yells and screams. And that particular night, the sea was like a mill pond, so it wasn't the sea. I wasn't a superstitious man, but when I heard the tape the next day, I was very, very glad to get off that Alkimos. I just don't want to go back on it again.
Graham Greenwood's fears of the Alkimos linger to this day, fears that are shared by his mate, Jack Sue.
While I was lying there, I suddenly heard somebody, a sort of a moan coming from the bunk behind me. A sound like somebody rolling over in their sleep, sort of, and I pricked my ears up. I thought I must have been hearing things. So I listened again, and sure enough, it came a second time. And I can tell you I wasted no time getting out of that cabin, because I wasn't imagining things.
For a time, the owners of the Alkimos employed Filipino watchmen, but they didn't last long. Again, the footsteps echoed through the night. Doors opened and closed of their own accord. Tools and equipment simply disappeared. After that, there was a young married couple who took up the challenge. She was pregnant, and heartbreaking tragedy was just around the corner. Perhaps it was Henry. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. But one night during a gale, the woman suffered a bad fall on board. The beginning of yet another disastrous episode on the Alkimos. For hours, she lay there injured, in agony, with the baby due at any moment. On shore, the rescue operation was underway, a rescue that couldn't come too soon.
They eventually had to get four-wheel drives along to the beach, ambulance, police officers and other emergency crews, and they finally used a rocket to fire a line across from the beach and rig up a line along which they brought the woman off in a bosun's chair. She was then taken to hospital, of course, but she miscarried and a premature dead baby was the result. They left the wreck shortly after.
Many more caretakers were to be driven from this ghost ship. Sometimes it was the noises. Sometimes it was more specific. Cooking smells coming from the empty galley. The galley where there was no sign of food, and the stove was cold as ice. For more than 30 years, there's been speculation on what or who this ghost called Henry might be. A medium felt there'd been a murder on board. The dead had returned to haunt the living. At one stage, a priest was called in to exorcise the ghost. Unfortunately for him, he decided to do some fishing from the Alkimos deck before he tackled Henry.
The sinker came straight back to him as though someone had picked it, caught it at the other end and hurled it back, and it hit him right in the middle of the forehead. And he had to be carted off to hospital to have stitches inserted, and wasn't a very, very well man, so he never got the opportunity to, I don't think he made any attempt to exorcise the ghost. And to the best of my knowledge, never went back on the ship again.
In Western Australia, the Alkimos and its ghost achieved a degree of fame. Or was it infamy? There were staunch believers, and even stauncher disbelievers, anxious to prove or disprove the legend. One of the skeptics was Perth radio announcer Ted Bull.
Back in 1990, I thought, why don't I do something different for Halloween? And I looked around for ghost stories, for spooky houses and haunted things, and the thing that jumped out at me, of course, was the ghost ship, the Alkimos.
Technically, everything was in order. Tests had proved beyond doubt there'd been no problems broadcasting from alongside the Alkimos that Halloween. Maybe Ted Bull's jokey theme music was tempting fate, tempting Henry. But as you'll hear from an actual tape of the show, things started to go wrong. Things the technicians back on shore could not explain.
I think it's amazing. Several times when we've mentioned Henry this morning, we've been cut off.
And then when we actually swung around the boat, I thought, oh, we might lose the program because of technical reasons. It was explained to me, no, that couldn't happen. And it did. As we went around the Alkimos, and it wasn't like we'd go off and stay off. It was intermittent. It would go off and then come back on. And as I said, every time we mentioned Henry that would happen.
It's almost 4 years since that abandoned broadcast. And now the Alkimos is disintegrating and deserted.
We've all seen that the ship is just about ready to collapse. I think it'll be lucky to see another winter out. It's all perforated right along the waterline now, and once that goes, the rest of it will just drop.
And for those who've survived the Alkimos and the ghostly watchman who walks her decks, that day cannot come quickly enough. The sooner the battered steamer goes to her watery grave, the better. Kangaroo Island
is just off the South Australian coast. 4,500 square kilometres of pristine beauty. A place steeped in history.
This is the Southern Ocean. Down that way, the Antarctic. Over there, mainland Australia. It's rugged down here. A rocky island that at times is buffeted by ferocious seas and brutish winds. For sailors, Cape Willoughby has long been a welcome sight. It offered solace, confirmation of course, and safety. But for some, the lighthouse on those sharp cliffs is a dark and frightening place.
Songwriter Clive Daniels and his wife Robin have experienced the tranquility, the solitude, and the mystery of Cape Willoughby and its lighthouse, the first one built in South Australia in 1852.
I could put it into words, this place is a poet's dream. It's one of fascination and the unknown.
Back in April 1993, the Daniels, along with members of their family and friends, were here for a weekend reunion. They had the Cape to themselves. Even the ranger was away. And from the very start, there were ominous signs that this was to be no ordinary holiday. The first member of the party to sense something strange was Clive's sister, Shirley Buckley.
I put my things on the bed and I really felt uncomfortable. It was really, really very cold. And I thought, I don't like it. There was a bad atmosphere in there. I didn't like it at all.
The first night passed peacefully enough, and Clive Daniels was getting down to the serious business of songwriting. By the second night, he knew exactly where and when he'd find his inspiration. Up in the old lighthouse at midnight.
It was a night just like this, cold, still, and crystal clear, that things started to change for Clive. What was to follow would almost literally scare he and his wife out of their wits.
The lighthouse was deserted. Clive had the only key. All was silent, except for the waves crashing down below. The lamp above swept its arc across the lonely sea. As Clive gingerly made his way through the eerie labyrinth by torchlight, he was oblivious to the gloom around him. Already words and music were floating through his mind.
Footsteps in the night, I hear all. Footsteps in the night, in the door.
As he settled down at the very top of the lighthouse to compose, the atmosphere inside slowly began to change, slowly began to seem threatening.
I heard a creaking sound, and it was almost like a wooden door opening. Just a slow but a definite creak of wood. And that sort of baffled me a bit because there's no wooden door there. And then I heard footsteps coming down.
Naturally, he was nervous. But then, inexplicably, his torch died on him. A torch with a brand new battery. And all about him, inside the darkened lighthouse, Clive could feel a presence like nothing on earth.
It was just like an icy cold mist that was all around me. It almost touched me, but when I reached out, I could feel it. It was a dry, icy cold chill. And as you reached into it, you could feel it. You knew that something was there, believe me. You knew that it was watching you, yet you couldn't see it.
Icy cold. So cold, Clive could feel the shivers down his spine. The shivers of fear.
I thought for the first time in my life, it's time to go. I knew whatever it was in there didn't want me in there. So I put my guitar in the case and I felt my way down the steps. At the same time, with my right hand, I was trying to find the key to the lighthouse so I could get out there and lock it up and and just leave. I felt uncomfortable there.
Darkness, strange noises, icy pockets of air, and not a soul to be seen. Was it the mind playing tricks, or was it something else? Clive decided it was something else, something he couldn't explain. And as he locked up and left, the mystery of Cape Willoughby deepened. First, just as suddenly as it went out, his torch went on again. And then...
I looked back at the lighthouse, and I could feel something was watching me almost from the top window. And it was... you could almost feel as though there's someone up there. It was really strange, you know, it's quite strange.
The eerie presence that Clive Daniels felt in the Cape Willoughby lighthouse chilled him. The appearance of a silhouette in the lighthouse window had unsettled him greatly. Was his mind playing tricks, or was this dark, brooding landscape home to a ghostly apparition? Perplexed and afraid, Clive returned to the room he was sharing with his wife Robin. He decided not to disturb her, but it seems that icy, ghostly presence had other ideas.
Shortly after, must have been about half an hour after, my wife suddenly woke up and she sensed a presence in the room, and she said, "What's that?" And I could feel it too. It was almost that same sort of presence you had in the lighthouse. The sort of the eerie feeling that someone was watching you, someone was there almost, you know. And I reached up into the air and just see if I could touch it. And it's strange. As soon as you lift your arm, it goes icy cold.
And I said, "Someone's in here," because it felt like someone was watching me, not like your little daughter coming in and saying, "Mum," you know, when you're asleep. It was like something bigger.
Just shortly after that, the shower started running, and my wife commented to me about the shower running. She says, "Who would be having a shower so early in the morning?" I looked at my watch and it's 2:30 in the morning.
For 15 minutes, the shower continued. And when it eventually stopped, Robin decided to investigate.
I couldn't believe it. There was no mist, there was no steam, the floor was completely dry. No one had, the towels were all neat, the bath mat was still hanging and it was dry. And I came back to my husband and I said, there was no one in the bathroom.
That morning, the party assembled early for breakfast, just after 5 o'clock in fact.
When my husband came in, he was looking very white, very frightened, and a little bit confused.
And there were questions that had to be asked.
Hey, who's the keen one that got up at 2:30 in the morning and had a shower?
No one could answer that. Not one of them had been anywhere near the bathroom all night. Then, Clive's sister Shirley told them that during the night, she'd had the distinct impression that someone had entered her room.
The shape that I saw was a shape that was on the chair, and I thought this looks for all the world like there's somebody sitting there, you know, and so I thought, oh, I'm not sure about this, and I waited for the light to flash around the room again to have another look, and sure enough it was still there. And I thought, well, I don't know, it must be luggage or a backpack or something that was left on the chair from the night before. And I could try to convince myself of that fact.
But at dawn, when Shirley checked, the backpack was nowhere near the chair. Stranger still, there was a trail of sand across the room. It hadn't been there the night before, and none of the group had been to the beach. Finally, there was one more thing, the one that finally sent the family packing.
We were all sitting around at the table, and all of a sudden the newspaper that was on the seat next to my wife, the pages started to turn over on their own, and there was no window open, no door, and my wife jumped about, must have been about a foot in the air.
We had to move because they were They're slightly they were fearful of what could have happened, and they couldn't explain the unexplained.
Robin and Clive Daniels did try. They discovered that Cape Willoughby Lighthouse looms above a boiling gorge called the Devil's Kitchen. Since records were first kept back in 1847, more than 40 ships have been lost at sea off the coast here. In most cases, sailors lost their lives. And at least one lighthouse keeper died on duty. His name was John Tapley, and he was found dead in the lantern room at 6 a.m. on January the 23rd, 1869. The Daniels now wonder whether John Tapley's still around, or whether the presence at Cape Willoughby is the ghost of a sailor who perished out at sea. Whatever the answer, none will ever satisfy Shirley Buckley.
I wouldn't go and stay the night there again. No. The daytime I'd go to visit because it was a beautiful place and I loved it, but definitely not at night.
Footsteps in the night, the door.
And as for Clive Daniels, he did get to write those songs. The lyrics, though, don't offer any explanation for the icy mist, the footsteps, the noises, or anything else that happened that April night at Cape Willoughby.
We're all very sceptical that it's changed our perspective in life tremendously, to think that what you had beliefs in before and couldn't exist, it does exist. It's out there, believe me.
Ready to be frightened? The band Wildland set out to make a video clip of their new song. Nothing unusual about that. But when they looked at the film in the edit suite, there was an unknown figure in the background. A figure with a severed head. With the fast edits, the switches from colour to black and white, it's not something you'd pick up watching a video hit show at home on television. But slow one particular image down and enhance it and see what happens. There in the background is a figure, a human figure, a figure without a face.
It is a person. It definitely a human being, but we find that there's no. I've had looked at it closer since then, and there's no image on the face. I mean, I'm not one for getting into ghost stories, so to speak, but this has left quite an impression as to why this would appear in this particular instance.
Martin Lee was one of the cameramen on location that day, back in 1990. He actually shot the scene in question. But he's as baffled now as he was when he first noticed the figure, when the clip was being edited 4 years ago.
I had no explanation for it because it was not there when I shot it. It's quite, it's very haunting.
Even more haunting when he tells you there were no strangers at the location that afternoon, and every single member of the crew was accounted for. As well, Martin Lee is certain there was nothing, no one there when he shot the film.
I have no doubts that if the person had been in shot, I would have picked them up straight away.
But how could a figure appear in the background of a film shoot without anyone knowing it was there? None of the crew noticed anything untoward at the time. Could it have something to do with the dark and turbulent past of this historical part of Australia? The place is called Glen Davis, and it's just outside Lithgow in western New South Wales. And no one knows it better than Leonie Knapman, who grew up here and is writing a book about the rise and fall of her old hometown.
We had no electricity, so therefore no lights, and we had no fridge. Our food was kept down the well or the bottles tied on a string in the creek. And we made our own entertainment. I mean, we walked the mountains. We had no Christmas tree like people usually do. We had a gum tree. You made your own decorations. We had no shops. So it was a very simple life.
Glenn Davis sprang to life during the Second World War, when the Australian government of the day decided the country needed to produce its own petrol. There were abundant shale deposits nearby, and these were mined, then refined into fuel. For the workers, it was tough, dangerous, even deadly.
There were 2 that were burnt when gas blew back, and they were taken to hospital and died later. Another man was crushed underneath the retorts. So there were lots of fatalities in that early period. So a lot of the men paid dearly for establishing this industry.
But this was an industry that was to be short-lived. By the early 50s, the plant was closed. The townsfolk began to disperse, and Glenn Davis degenerated into a ghost town. And a ghost town was what Martin Lee found when he arrived to film that video clip in 1990.
A most desolate place, a haunting place, perfect place to shoot rock clips, no doubt about it. I'd love to go back there again and do some more, but on reflection back, yes, it had some sort of atmosphere that was quite unexplainable.
Almost as unexplainable as the faceless figure who appeared in the finished film clip.
The top 40 exposure the other week seemed to have...
Chris Moss from Sony Music was the man who marketed the band and the clip Wildland. He wasn't there for the shoot, but he remembers vividly the first time he heard about the mysterious unpaid extra lurking in the background at Glenn Davis.
One of the members of the band, Noel, virtually came flying in over the telephone and said, "You just wouldn't believe what's happened here. We've discovered there's a figure on film that basically nobody can account for on the day of the shoot. You know, in real terms, we think there's a ghost on the video."
A ghost in dark clothing, possibly wearing an overcoat. A ghost without a face.
The response from everybody was one of absolute skepticism. You know, "Oh, no, you're wrong, it's like a watermark on the film, or it was somebody that was standing there. It was a shadow that was thrown, it was the way that the sun came over, it was, I mean, any one of 1,000 things that everybody came up with, because nobody was prepared to actually just say, well, it's a ghost." We then took it out to the television shows and played it to the producers and directors out there and threw down the challenge, and they pretty much came back with the same answer as we did, which was, there is no answer. Nobody knew what it was.
Leonie Knapman, the Glenn Davis historian, actually helped the producers choose the site where the clip was filmed, and she took us back to the exact spot the other day. Leonie, too, is mystified by the ghostly guest appearance, but she does have her theories.
At first I thought maybe somebody had come down off the mountain just to watch the filming. But when you watch the video and you watch the figure, that does not appear to be a face. It's very unclear. And so you wonder about the deaths that occurred in the area. Whilst nobody actually died in the powerhouse, one of the workers did die upstream, and his body was washed down into the bend of the river just over from this location. One of the others to die was actually in the retort area, and his head was almost severed in a very bad accident, and he died later in hospital. So who knows, it could explain the face that's missing from the figure.
Maybe. But there's one more twist to this ghostly tale. Enhance the video image even more, and you may see that not only is the figure faceless, at times the head looks as though it is severed from the body. late one night on a lonely back road. A couple trapped by floodwaters. Faint, ghostly headlights appear in the distance. The beginning of a frightening experience no one can explain.
If he hadn't turned up at the time, I wouldn't be sitting here. I now believe that it is quite possible that somebody from the other side of life can come to your rescue.
Frank Corbell is now 70 years old, comfortable in his retirement, but he's lived a disciplined and adventurous life. First as a pilot in the Luftwaffe during World War II. Then, after migrating to Australia in the 1950s, serving his new country in the Vietnam War. Along the way, he met and fell in love with Stella Lord. In 1965, they were married. She was with him on the night of May the 29th, 1974, the night of the flood and the ghostly rescue. Frank was driving Stella to her father's birthday party, a long and treacherous trip. Floodwaters blocked the main highway, so the Corbells took a detour, a very dangerous detour.
I drove down into the water. The water got higher and higher, and the engine cut out. My wife uttered a scream and put her feet up on the dashboard. And my mind was racing, what could I do?
I felt really terrified and just hoping against hope that we would get out of it. But at the time, I don't think I thought there was much chance.
If I had gotten out of the car, I would have had to swim, and I don't think I would have had a chance against the strong current. But my wife was inside and she can't swim, so it was a losing situation.
A desperate situation. The car stalled in floodwaters, the water rising. No hope of starting the engine. No hope, it seemed, of rescue.
I think we would have definitely gone down, and I can't swim. And so Frank knew that, and he was frightened, I think, that what would happen.
Then, behind them, a sight they could not believe. Headlights piercing through the mist, a glint of chrome in the moonlight, an eerie vision that began to take shape. The shape of a strange black limousine, edging closer and closer through the floodwaters. A bump, another one. The Corbells feel their car being nudged slowly toward dry land by the silent stranger.
It may have taken a minute or so, but I thought it was an eternity. And slowly we got through the depth of the water and finished up on the other side of the river.
But before the Corbells could thank the limo driver, before they could utter a word, the mysterious saviour disappeared. There was just a glimpse of the driver, middle-aged, wearing a jacket and tie, and...
He looked I wouldn't say he looked lifeless, but he didn't show any emotions at all.
Naturally, Frank and Stella were shocked and bewildered. You see, when they inspected the rear of the car, there was nothing, not one extra scratch. No sign that the black limousine had bumped them through the floodwaters.
I think that driver saved our lives. I don't know whether he was meant to do that or whether it was just an accident that he appeared. But without him pushing us out, we would have been swept away. I'm quite sure of that.
The Corbells' problems weren't over. They were wet, cold, and still stranded in the middle of nowhere. Minutes later, though, there was a second coincidence on this deserted bush byway. A second set of headlights appeared through the mist. This time it was a van. No mistake, no apparition.
How are you?
Thanks, mate.
What's the problem?
While they worked on the waterlogged car, Frank asked the van driver if he'd seen the black limousine on the road. If there'd been one, the driver must have sighted it. His answer was no. There was no other car on that road at that time, that night. The black limo had vanished into thin air.
Okay, have a nice day. See you later.
Thanks very much indeed.
Not a problem.
For more than 20 years, Frank and Stella Corbell have pondered over those frightening hours back in 1974 when they came so close to drowning. All they know is they survived. The question they ask is, were they plunged even deeper into the unknown?
I'm beginning to wonder whether that car and that man who pushed me out were actually real, because it was something which is just not normal. An experience like that is a very strong message to you. And when you sit down years after and think about it, you might think, well, perhaps it was my guardian angel.
It's near midnight. I feel the cold in my bones. Some say ghosts feel like that all the time, especially those who met a grisly end in this life.
In the wild colonial days, Fred Fisher was one of those pioneers who had the stuff legends are made of. In life and in death, he's helped enrich Australia's folklore. You see, more than a century and a half after he was brutally murdered, Fred's ghost can still be heard around his old hometown. A ghost with a mission and a wicked sense of humour.
Oh, Fred's a larrikin. He's got an attitude on him.
Fred Fisher's story begins in the settlement of Campbelltown in the early 1800s. As old Sydney town pushed ever westward, the bush was raised to make way for cattle and crops. It was a land of opportunity, where ex-convicts rubbed shoulders with landholders.
Fisher was a young shopkeeper in London, and he was in his early 20s when he was caught red-handed. He had forged banknotes in his possession, and next thing he was transported to New South Wales for 14 years.
Historian Verley Fowler has traced Fred Fisher's colourful life and times. She's discovered that he served only half the 14-year sentence, and by 1826 he'd become a respected landowner and builder. Around that time, he had a neighbour called George Worrell, the man who was to become his nemesis.
And at the time, Fisher didn't have a house to live in, so Fisher moved in with Worrell next door. As well, there were a number of workmen employed by Fisher. They were also living in Worrell's house, and there was quite a crowd of them actually, and they used to go down to the local hotel drinking at night. But then one night on the 17th of June 1826, Fisher just suddenly mysteriously disappeared. Worrell was arrested and questioned about what had happened to Fisher. He stuck to the story that Fisher had gone back to England.
So, what the police had was a missing man, a suspect, but no body. For months the investigation stalled, and then there was a breakthrough, a vital clue that some believe came from the dead man himself.
Late one night, a local identity, John Farley, was stumbling home after a heavy night at one of the local taverns. His route took him along a deserted bush track near Fred Fisher's place. He came to a wooden bridge, and there, right ahead, was a sight that shocked him into sobriety. A man with a bloody head wound sitting on the bridge railing. Slowly he began beckoning, pointing to the creek below. That man was Fred Fisher, the late Fred Fisher.
The next day, a bewildered John Farley told police what he'd seen. By coincidence, at about the same time, two boys were playing around the old bridge. They stumbled on a trail of blood. That trail of blood was exactly where the ghost of Fred Fisher had pointed.
The police brought in two black trackers, and quite amazingly, it didn't take them very long to find where the body was buried. They recovered the body, and it was obvious that Fisher had been brutally bashed. His head was just completely caved in, and it had been a very brutal murder.
And that was the end of Fisher's neighbour, George Worrell, brought to justice with the help of a ghost.
George Worrell was found guilty of the murder, and he was hanged. There were two men still locked up after he'd been hanged, but at that stage the authorities decided to drop the charges against them, so they were freed. So only Worrell was hanged for the murder.
It seems, though, Fred Fisher still had some unfinished business. 30 years ago, for instance, Marlene Skipper is certain she saw Fisher's ghost. At that time, Marlene, her husband, and their young daughter Tracy lived in a house built on the property once owned by Fred Fisher. Strange things happened in that house, especially on the staircase and in the rooms on the top floor.
And that's where this person was who was staring at me. And although I wasn't game to look, I was too scared to look, I just knew he was there. I just wouldn't look up. The hair would stick up on the back of my neck, and you get shivery because you know that there is somebody there watching you.
From that moment, Marlene was so terrified she refused to go up those stairs ever again. Strangely enough, though, her daughter Tracy had no fear at all. She turned the haunted staircase and the top floor into a world of her own. And one night, Marlene's husband Harry learned the ghostly secret of Tracy's world.
He heard Tracy running around screaming. She sounded like she was chasing something or someone was chasing her. So he ran up there, 2 or 3 steps. He was panicking. There was nothing up there. He picked Tracy up and brought her downstairs, and she started crying. She wanted to talk to Uncle Fred. So we sat her down and said, "Who's Uncle Fred?" And she showed us he was her friend, and they played together, and they played chasings and skippings, and they sing songs.
Got two of them are yellow, 3 of them are brown.
We had no relations called Fred. There just wasn't any Freds, and she couldn't even say uncle and auntie properly. So, no, there was no Uncle Freds in the family. She couldn't have mistaken it for anybody else. Nothing even by the sound. Sounding like Fred. Nothing.
Was Tracy's playmate the ghost of Fred Fisher? That's the way local legend has it. And flick through the Campbelltown archives and you have to admit the evidence does build up. Take the case of the film company back in the 1920s that decided the legend of Fisher's ghost would make a great movie. It was a decision they'd regret, all the way to bankruptcy.
They had all sorts of production problems, I understand, and immediately after the film was finished, the whole company collapsed in financial disarray. Again, who can say, is that Fred?
For years, journalist Jeff McGill has been chronicling the activities of Fisher's ghost in the pages of the local newspaper, always with his tongue planted firmly in his cheek. That was until 1982, when they moved to new premises. The new building just happened to be on Fred Fisher's old property, And one afternoon, Jeff McGill was working alone in the deserted top floor.
That was when I heard a voice talking at me, and it was really weird because I couldn't tell whether it's male or female to this day. I could have been that sensation you get when they are definitely talking at you. And I said, sorry? You know, who's there? And there was no answer. And I thought it was somebody skylarking down trying to put the wind up me. So I thought I'd turn the tables, and I jumped up and sort of dived out into the hallway, and there was no one there. And at that exact moment, the pigeons that roost or nest out near the air conditioning ducts at the back of the building, suddenly, like a bolt out of the blue, just shot off with the feathers flying, and at that exact time, a very, very cold sensation in the hallway.
With the experience of history to go on, the owners of the Fisher's Ghost restaurant were taking a risk when they named it after Fred. There's every indication he's none too pleased, and has made his presence felt more than once. One morning, the owner, a former mayor of Campbelltown, Gordon Fetter Place, was first to arrive and found all 4 fires blazing. All the lights turned on, and that was against Gordon's strict instructions. Not surprisingly, he wanted to know why when the assistant manager arrived.
And she said, look, Gordon, I put them out, and what's more, I went upstairs twice to make sure that they were out, and the lights were definitely out.
Gordon and his staff were just getting over that when they were confronted by this, another of Fred's practical jokes. Again, an empty restaurant, but this time, every single painting on the walls tipped sideways. No one had been in the restaurant overnight. There were no signs of a break-in. Just a sneaking suspicion that Fisher's ghost had been at it again. And finally, it seems the ghost is attracted by the theatre, a down-under Phantom of the Opera. Here, there's been an unexplained presence for years, officially unexplained, but the Campbelltown cast and crew have no doubts who it is. On a Saturday afternoon, Greg Dillon was working alone in the props department. Well, maybe not quite alone.
I heard footsteps across the stage. They were distinctive footsteps, not hurried, just walking across the stage. And I expected to see somebody pop down the stairs at the side and to where I was working, but nobody arrived. And I carried out a search of the theatre, and there was nobody at all in the theatre.
With this particular ghost, it's often a case of lights, theatre, action. Take just one rehearsal. Director Barbara Handley was putting the cast through their paces. Suddenly, they were rudely interrupted.
The lady that was the musical director was down in the orchestra pit along with just a pianist, no one else. And the lights went off in the orchestra pit. And the musical director says, oh, for goodness sake, put the lights back on Fred, because we always call him Fred. And the lights just went back on in front of all those people.
That was with a crowd of people. The ghost encore came when Barbara Handley was in the darkened theatre. It was late at night. She was by herself.
I heard sounding like somebody walking through the auditorium. So I called out, and they stopped, and I thought, oh, I was hearing things. And then they started up again. So I started to back towards the door, really scared. I was really quite upset. You know, it really frightened me that night. And being on your own, so I never come in the theatre on my own.
A man murdered back in 1836. A ghost that's haunted a community across 2 centuries. Sometimes a benevolent ghost, occasionally more sinister. Eric Buchanan is one of Australia's most experienced professional divers. He's been diving in Sydney Harbour for almost half a century. He knows all its tricks and treacheries. But there was one job, one day, almost 30 years ago, that he'll never be able to forget. That day, he was working about 40 feet below the surface on the bottom of Sydney Harbour. New cables were being laid, and Eric's job was to inspect them, to make certain everything was going according to plan. He was decked out in a cumbersome hard hat and a bulky diving suit. He was alone down there, but he did have voice contact with a boat above. Today, he recounts what happened in his own down-to-earth, laconic way. But back then, 30 years ago, it was a frightening experience.
How I felt, a thump on the cable I was standing on, and I said, "Who's down here with me?" And they said, "Nobody." And I said, "There must be somebody down here because I can feel them walking up the cable." And they said, "No, there's no one down there with you." By this time, the object had got off the cables, walked across the cables, and was going up the western side of the trench. The sun was shining brightly in the water, and there was a perfect silhouette of a hard hat diver climbing up out of the trench into the sun and just kept going. So I got out and everyone had a great laugh about it, said I'd been down there too long and, I was seeing things, and I said, well, he was there.
Initially, Eric Buchanan thought there just had to be another diver down below, a real one, flesh and blood. But from all his experience, Eric knew if there had been another hard hat diver working the harbour, that diver would definitely have needed a backup boat.
But there was no boat and no chance for a diver being down there, a hard hat diver.
And that's definitely beyond doubt. We've spoken to another diver who was on the boat that day, and he confirms that there were no other boats in the area, no other divers down below. He also vividly remembers Eric Buchanan bursting to the surface and shouting that he'd seen a ghost. The underwater mystery played on Eric Buchanan's mind. He went over the eerie scene time and time again, and one by one, he discounted all the logical explanations.
There was no mud cloud. If I had walked across there, there'd been a great cloud of mud, but there was no mud cloud. There was no hose to the surface, and there was no air bubbles. A hard hat diver has a constant stream of air bubbles.
But that wasn't the end of the mystery. The day after Eric Buchanan saw the phantom diver, one of his colleagues working in the same place saw the same thing, and it scared the wits out of him.
The diver down there came rushing to the top, and he said, I just saw a diver walk past, a hard hat diver walk past.
2 sightings of a mysterious diver deep beneath the harbour. A diver who couldn't possibly have been there. Who or what was it? According to Eric Buchanan, perhaps the answer lies back in the 1920s and 30s, when the magnificent Sydney Harbour Bridge was under construction.
I found out that a hard hat diver, had been killed building the bridge. Now, I don't know whether they ever recovered the body or not, but as far as I'm concerned, he's still down there walking around.
When Hollywood's favourite son, Michael Landon, died several years ago, he left behind a legacy of courage and goodwill that endures to this day for millions of the world's television viewers. He also left behind an extended family of 9 children who knew the private strengths of their father. We were lucky enough to be given a glimpse into that private world through one of Michael Landon's sons. From little Joe Cartwright on the Ponderosa Ranch in the TV series Bonanza, to Angel Jonathan Smith in the hit series Highway to Heaven 30 years later, Michael Landon knew about fighting the odds. His final challenge would take place as a real-life drama before a national TV audience when he learned he was dying of cancer in 1991.
I think every moment just gets a little more important after something like this.
Though he would finally succumb to fate, Landon did it in a style that was vividly familiar to this man, Mark Landon, the son Michael adopted when he was 12 years old.
Life is about how you handle what's thrown at you. And what he wanted everybody to do is to learn to handle what comes your way. You seize life. You take it on, and you approach it, you make the best of every situation you can.
Mark Landon recalls the father who took him in with the love and fondness of a young boy describing his hero.
Dad always had a wild, wacky sense of humor. When I was a kid and I first met him, we were like 2 cartoon characters. And we both laughed a lot of that laughter.
In some ways, Michael Landon was more than human to the family he left behind. He was a Superman with powers they couldn't explain. Even at a family gathering like Christmas, he seemed to know things nobody else did.
We used to play this game like on his birthday and Christmas time, and it's like he'd put his hand over the presents that were wrapped. I'd bring a present, thousands of presents. I mean, he would get like 9, 10, 11, 12. Perfect. He would guess what the presents were. I said, Dad, how do you do that? He goes, I get like vibes. He put his hand over the presents, like a few inches off. No cheating. And I mean, this is for real. Remember, like Mike Jr. saw him do this and he kind of went, I mean, like, it was really, this makes you start thinking maybe there's some truth to this stuff. Because when it's that consistent, I mean, like 10 in a row.
Wherever Michael is today, Mark believes he is exploring.
I think he'd be flying around exploring other planets right now. Because he loved more information. Loved to read. Loved to, like, absorb scientific information. So I figure, yeah, he'd be flying between the galaxies, looking at other planets and other civilizations. So he loved it.
And Mark is not certain, but he believes he may have had a visit from Michael since the star's death.
I was in my bedroom, and my window was open, and I sort of had this vision with my eyes closed of him flying up to my window with like 3 or 4 kids. And I said, Dad, how you doing? He would, not now, I got work to do. Like he was holding orphans. And then he just flew away. And I sort of opened my eyes and went, nah. But, I mean, how can I be sure I'm really seeing something like that? It's a vision that's based on his personality and the way he was.
He'll never know if Michael did come back to visit, but Mark does know that Michael believed his own father had reached him from the afterlife.
He was talking about, like, at the funeral, it's like he felt a presence, but he couldn't really be sure. But yeah, it felt like his father was there. And it's like he felt like maybe a hand did tap him. Maybe he did. He couldn't nail it down. And he felt like an ambience of, it's all right, I'm all right, and everything's going to be all right.
By night, it's forbidding, forsaken. The ruins of an outpost that was devoid of humanity, devoid of hope. Ruins which are haunted by the ghosts of the damned.
It would have been the most brutal place on earth. I remember when I was young that it was compared to the concentration camps, Belsen, and the horrors here that went on.
A century and a half ago, Norfolk Island was one of Britain's most notorious penal colonies, a dumping ground for the most vicious, most violent criminals. A jail where the savagery of the inmates was more than matched by the ferocity of their keepers.
It would be called a blood-soaked island because of the blood that was let from lashings. People got sometimes 200 or 300, 400 strokes of the lash, cat o' nine tails. Sometimes their backs, the skin was flayed off their backs so that the bones were showing. And there were also so many murders. Quite often a convict would just up and kill the next fellow to him for no reason at all.
Within the first 2 weeks, they had something like 11 hangings. Their punishment was such that they were committing ridiculous crimes just to get the death penalty. I mean, they were treated like animals.
Norfolk Island was discovered by the English explorer Captain James Cook in 1774. Its isolation, deep in the South Pacific, midway between Noumea and New Zealand, made it the ideal site for a penal colony. And by the mid-1880s, almost 2,000 convicts were condemned to this hell on earth. Wander through Norfolk Graveyard today, and you can read its turbulent history etched in stone. Hardship, shoulder to shoulder with heroism. And in one section, names from the past: Christian, Quintal, Buffett. Names that hark back to the mutiny on the Bounty. That's because descendants of the mutineers, part Polynesian, part European, settled on Norfolk in 1856. They're known as the Pitcairners, and with their arrival, Norfolk's ghostly reputation was born.
The island would be a totally ghost-saturated island. I would say probably at least 50% of the people who live here have heard of or have seen or felt some strange phenomenon. It's very hard to explain, but once you've seen it, you never forget. That is for sure.
Nan Smith has lived here 50 years. It's a house with a century of history and hauntings. Hauntings that Nan has experienced firsthand.
I realised that it was a ghost. I couldn't believe my eyes because I never believed in any such thing before.
That first shock was back in 1948, when Nan Smith was a teenager. She was asleep. It was around midnight. Not a light, not a sound, but something woke her. As Nan opened her eyes, there before her was a young woman. A woman in a long white dress, her blonde hair parted in the middle. And her eyes. Her eyes are what Nan remembers most vividly.
She looked desperately sad. She gave off a sort of an aura that made you feel very sad. I was so frightened or so terrified I couldn't move, I couldn't even call out. I remember just sort of staring at her for as long as I could until I had to blink and then she just gradually faded away.
Over the years, the young woman has reappeared many times, never moving, never saying a word, just there, surrounded by an aura of tragedy. She's always seemed benevolent, but the same cannot be said of another inhabitant of the Smith household, an evil influence in the second bedroom.
Emanating from that corner, there seemed to be a great force like a blast, and it blew the door into the hall closed with a great bang.
I could take a week to tell of ghostly experiences that I have. No, it's certainly different. I mean, I can feel it. I can even feel it now.
Puss Anderson is the boss of Norfolk's restoration team, working in the heart of the historic Kingston area, the site of the old jail. Like many islanders, he admits he's superstitious, but he's convinced Kingston is haunted.
When we were restoring the barracks, we came across a convict settle or seat, or settee, in our modern day terms.
That wooden seat's been traced back to the 99th Regiment, stationed on the island last century. 2 years ago, Puss Anderson and his team stored the seat in the Royal Engineers Office, right in the heart of the old convict settlement. Every night, they checked that it was okay. Every morning when they returned, the seat had been moved, sometimes violently. All the doors were bolted, all the windows locked. No human could have entered that room. And this went on day after day, until a medium from New Zealand arrived on the scene.
She said it's the body of a teenage girl that was raped and buried alive by the officers occupying the building of the time, and all she wanted to do was for someone to hear a plight. You mightn't believe that story, but from that day on, for about 2 years, that seat never ever moved again.
But just recently, ghost-like figures appeared at the barracks themselves, where the 99th Regiment would have been billeted. They were seen in the turret by another member of the restoration team, Wiggy Napton.
I saw two figures. One was a soldier-type fella, dressed with his peak cap and old-style jacket, and the other one seemed to be a superior of some description. They were looking out across the field towards the old prison. And then they just stood there for a second or two, and the soldier guessed it out with his hand like that, and then they nodded and turned round and walked down.
Wiggy Napton couldn't believe what he'd seen, so he went to investigate.
And when I went round there was no sign of a stair or ladder, and there was no floor. All you could see was the 10-inch ledge where the floor used to be.
In other words, nowhere for anyone to stand, let alone two men who'd been dead for more than 100 years.
And after seeing that, I think I do believe there is ghosts around.
A sentiment shared by Shane Quintal, a Pitcairner who can trace his ancestry back to the Bounty. He works in the Norfolk Cemetery, cataloguing the gravestones for the island archives. One morning, he was inspecting the inscriptions on the tombstones.
I heard a voice say to me, "Oh, excuse me." And I thought, oh, yeah. So I looked around and there was a couple of women further up the road there, and I thought, oh, there must have been just their voices had drifted down.
Shane thought no more about the voice and moved on to another gravestone. By now, the cemetery was deserted. He was alone.
Whilst I was down there, I heard this, oh, excuse me. You know, it was quite stern. So I said, oh, could you hold on a sec? Then it was, excuse me. Looked around and there was nobody in the cemetery.
Not only that, both voices were female. The tombstone and the gravestone both marked the last resting places of women named Quintal, Shane Quintal's ancestors.
You know, it sort of made you get that little chilly feeling and you think, oh dear, what have I done here? You know, have I upset somebody or something? Because I don't know, what else could it be?
Just across the road from the graveyard, you'll find Quality Row, where for more than 100 years ghosts have been felt, seen and heard. Phantom footsteps, piercing screams, chills in the night. One night, Maeve Hitch was at number 7 Quality Row, sitting by the fire after dinner, the only light from the flickering flames. Maeve began to sense a malevolent force in the room.
It was as if a hand touched me and pushed my face around, right around. It wasn't a painful feeling, but it was a fear, a heavy feeling on my shoulders, my head, and the whole room, the whole atmosphere in the room.
Almost hypnotically, Maeve's attention was drawn to the darkened open doorway, and slowly a vision appeared, a giant luminous cobweb.
About 8 feet long, across the doorway, right across the doorway. It wasn't like a spider's web or a web that you see indoors. It was very, very thick.
The web hovered there for 10 seconds or so. Then it disappeared.
But that heavy feeling was still there. So whatever it was still in the house. When it did leave, it just lifted. It seemed to lift. The atmosphere went and there was no heavy feeling on me at all.
A century and a half after the brutal convict days, it seems the spirits of the dead remain. Spirits that haunt the living and make Norfolk truly an island of ghosts.
I know that some people think, oh no, they're totally crazy seeing spirits. You know, how can they do this? But it was there. You actually see it. I mean, there's hundreds of people that have seen the spirits here on Norfolk Island. So I don't think we're crazy.
The Rashid family is something of a miracle in itself. An American story of Lebanese immigrants settling in the New World, seeking and finding good fortune, and propagating so widely that its members are in every state. Life magazine, Look magazine, and many other journals have, through the years, reported on how the Rashids grew in number to 3,500 and produced their own family newspaper each month. Dr. Philip Rashid is one of 18 children born to a beautiful and extraordinary woman named Saida.
My mother was a tiny woman. She weighed 85 pounds and she was about 5 feet tall, but she had the aggressiveness and the intelligence. She couldn't read nor write a word of English, but she had an adding machine in her head, and she learned to speak Spanish, French, Arabic, and English. She educated herself. She didn't solve our problems for us, but what she did was show us how to cope with it, and that's where she came through.
The relationship between Philip and his mother is at the core of an epic saga of love, remorse, and redemption. Before reaching its final wondrous finale, it would take his life from wealth and flamboyance down into the deepest pits of depression.
I felt like I didn't see the trees, I didn't see the leaves on the trees, I didn't see the birds, I didn't see the flowers. I became in another world. I felt lost. I felt, I hated myself. I thought, what did you do? You killed your own mother that you felt for? That was the feeling I had.
From earliest childhood, Philip Rashid's admiration for Saida knew no bounds. He believed he had the perfect life with the perfect family. He was always an extremely religious man, once considered the priesthood. In the town where he settled, Fairfield, California, he was a respected oral surgeon, but he also became a sort of master of ceremonies for every social, charity, and cultural event he could involve himself with.
I was a show-off. I wanted to get in the stage and have everybody give me a standing ovation, which I deserved. I was a happy-go-lucky person.
And then came the day Philip Rashid would do something that would change the course of his life forever.
All of a sudden, my younger sister, there were three of us there, the oldest and youngest and myself, and she says, "Philip," she hollered for, "you better hurry, something's going on with Mom." And I ran in the room, and there she was struggling for air, and I dived right in and put the head back and started the routine treatment.
There was a moment there when Philip felt that his mother's life was in his hands alone.
I worked at it maybe for just kept at it thinking, she's coming back, and no way.
Saida passed away while in his hands.
And at that moment, I felt I'm the guilty one. I thought maybe had I not taken her to the doctor, maybe if we didn't give her these pills, maybe this, maybe that. And I felt, well, it was my error, that I'm the cause of this.
Saida's doctor probably didn't help his spirits when he later explained a theory on heart massage.
He said, "I think maybe you don't feel bad because you didn't want to hurt your mother." And in giving the percussion, I was a little easy about it when I should have really, but I just couldn't do that. I couldn't beat on her like that.
From that day, Philip Rashid would enter a world of bleak remorse. He would lose his flamboyance. Possessions no longer had their appeal. His practice lost its joy.
I was good for nothing. I burned out all day long. I'd see patients, and it'd work in my mind. It's funny, I can save this patient, and I couldn't do that for her. It would always come back to me.
In those bad years, Philip would sometimes look for signs, some signal from anywhere that would say his mother forgave him.
I'd drive down the highway and imagine I see the telephone pole look like a cross. There's the vision. Now, that's what she's telling me. That's it. Then I give out the telephone pole. I know that wasn't it.
And with the ever-deepening depression, Philip Rashid's health would begin to deteriorate. But one of his visits to his doctor would again be the next epic turning point of his life. It happened 4 years ago.
I was having some trouble in breathing, and the doctor felt I should have a complete chest x-ray of the lung.
As he sat in the reception area awaiting the results, Philip heard a small commotion among the nurses in the examining room.
The nurse that took the x-ray and the technician I was waiting in the reception room, and she's, "My God, look at this." And so I thought, my God, there must be cancer then, because of the way they're reacting. And the doctors ran in, and nurses and technicians, and they're all looking. And I thought, well, I've got to go in there. So I barged in, and I looked at it, and they says, "Take a look at this."
And there on the light board was the side x-ray of his chest. And as he got closer, Philip Rashid's heart began to pound.
First thing I looked at, I was looking for the pathology, because I know the cells and so forth. And I started looking around at it because I didn't think to look at the end here, because this is where the bulk of the material was. And I was trying to see, well, do I see something there? It looked like it could be connected to cancer. And they had said there's something strange about this, but they didn't tell me where it was. But when I moved into the outer portion, then I saw and I looked and I said, well, gee, here's something. And my God, that's my mother. That's her picture. That's her.
The sign. It had to be the sign. Look at this photo of Saida. Even the outline of her hair bun, her facial structure, the brow. For Dr. Philip Rashid, an extremely intelligent, rational, and religious man, the significance of this moment shook him.
I asked to have a copy of the x-ray, and I left the clinic and got into my car, and I picked it up and held it again and looked at it. I had gone maybe half a block, and I began the tears rolling in. I stopped the car. I cried.
There are doubters, even among his own family, but all agree it is their mother's face.
My sister refuses to accept it as a phenomena. She says it could be a phenomena, but it's not a miracle. And I say, it's a phenomena, it's a miracle, it's anything you want to call it, as long as it helps me and helps my fellow man to realize there is another life.
For Philip, though, the unexplainable existence of the image of Saida has become a fundamental rebirth.
She came to me, finally found a means of communication with me, and this is it. She appeared for that reason, to pacify me, to change my mind about what I felt the guilt about. And she's telling me from the face, the look on her face is, stop this and get on with your life.
He hesitated for 4 years before allowing his story to go public. He is a respected doctor, a town leader, a pillar of the church. Despite his deepest convictions, there is obvious risk in talking about it. His decision to tell the whole astonishing saga to us did not come easily. But he believes he will record the final chapter of his turbulent, emotional life and bring him the final freedom from the remorse that imprisoned him for so long. Philip's mother has blessed him.
There is no logical explanation for what you have just seen. You must remember, each story was told by the person who saw the apparition, heard the footsteps, spoke to or was spoken to by the ghost. They're ordinary people, not actors, and what happened fundamentally changed them forever. They know for sure there is something on the other side. They know there is something out there. Sleep well.
This is just a reminder to subscribe to enjoy our growing collection of paranormal content. Don't forget to like your favorite episode and ring the bell to be notified of new content. As always, thanks for watching.